All right, guys, welcome back to our teaching in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the last time we were here, we were at the beginning of chapter 9, dealing with the transfiguration of Jesus. And the way to understand it is that all of it is coming out from Jesus' declaration to the crowd as well as to his disciples, what it really meant to be a disciple and a follower of Jesus. Remember, it was after Peter's great confession that Jesus was the Christ, also Son of God, that Jesus began to teach them how that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer and be rejected and ultimately crucified by the leaders of the people. And Peter expressed his displeasure with this. He took Jesus to the side and began to rebuke Jesus. And Jesus, turning around and looking at the effect of Peter's behavior to the other disciples, Jesus began to teach them, even though he was teaching them in a parabolic form. Nevertheless, he was teaching them the essence or the nature of true discipleship. So he called the crowds along with his disciples to himself and began to tell them that it is necessary to deny yourself and take up your cross, which means be willing to suffer if you are going to be a follower of him. And thus he continued on to say that you have to understand the importance of the eternal, that is, the soul versus the right now. Even if you gain the world in its entirety, and who can imagine owning the whole world? But nevertheless, even if you could do so, how does that even begin to compare to eternity? For whatever you gain in this life is only temporal, is only temporary. Even if you were to enjoy it for 150 years, it's still just temporary. But the eternity of the soul is forever. And thus, Jesus is warning that if you're going to truly be a follower of him, you must be willing to follow after him in the path of suffering. And then he continues to simply say, okay, I'm sorry. I'm too much in the end of chapter 8. But there is so much of a direct connection with all of this. He continues to say, but it will not be this way forever. The Son of Man will return in glory. And thus he continues into chapter 9 and says that there are some of them who are listening to him at the present time who will be or will become an eyewitness of the glory of the Messiah. And that's when Jesus took 6 days later 3 witnesses, for the scripture says, in the eyes by the mouth of 3 witnesses establish everything to be, or a certain thing to be true. He took Peter, James, and John with him to a very high mountain, and he was transfigured. He was literally transformed from the inside outward. And in this, they saw the glory of the Messiah. And there was Moses and Elijah speaking with Jesus. And thus Jesus proved in essence that indeed he was the Messiah. He proved that one day he would return in great glory. But the idea is, especially for the disciples, if needs be, for now, you should suffer. But one day, the glory will come. The kingdom will come. And even your expectations, those expectations that align with scripture and with what God has determined, these things will come to pass, but not now. Now is the time of suffering. Okay. All right. So now let's continue on. We're going to look at verses 14 through 29. And it's interesting. Let me start by saying that this particular event, this is Jesus casting out the demon of a man's son, a very destructive demon. This particular event is carried in all of the synoptic gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Again, synoptic simply because they are similar. However, What is also too interesting is Mark carries this event in an unusual way. That is, Mark gives more description of the event. Since we have been walking through Mark, what we have known about Mark is his staccato way of dealing or recounting events. In other words, remember, one of the key words in the Gospel of Mark is immediately. Mark gives us vividness. He really turns on the movie theater of our mind so we can see the events as if they're happening in real time right before our eyes. But also, too, Mark doesn't waste time. Whatever Mark does, oftentimes you'll see other biblical writers carrying more details about a particular event. Mark usually doesn't do that. But this time, Mark carries more details than any of the synoptic writers. And that's unusual for Mark, which makes us sit back and begin to question and think to ourselves. Now, why is Mark's account longer than the other gospel writers? That is, Mark is trying to give us a perspective, a particular theme, or Mark is trying to say to us something else, or I shouldn't say something else, but even so, something more. Mark is emphasizing something more about this particular issue, or in this issue. Let me say it that way. In this issue, Mark is truly trying to emphasize to us something. And that's the reason why his account is so much longer, not just for the vividness of it, but for the impact that Mark is trying to give. So let us look at this text. Now, I don't believe, you guys know me when I ever say it's not going to be long. Sometimes it's long, but this time, I'm hoping, I don't think it's going to be long, but not because of the text is not a difficult text, but we want to really get into what Mark is trying to say as we sit back at the end of this text and try to understand, what are you trying to say? Dear God, what are you trying to say through Mark's writing to the disciples, even to us today? All right, so let's continue. When they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. Immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" Okay, so now we opened up, and Mark, again, now here's that fashion that we are so used to Mark. Coming down from the mountain, that was the last thing that Mark talked about, the Mount of Transfiguration. The way Mark just ties it together immediately, it seems that these things, even though particularly in as well as events, as far as chronological events, it did happen in this time, but it seemed immediately these things happen. Again, this is characteristic of Mark, but we learn from Luke, I do believe it is, that these events were on the next day. But again, that's why I said it earlier. Mark has this way of bringing things together rapidly. He goes quickly through the thing. He doesn't waste a lot of time. But for some reason, he spends a great deal of time talking about this event. We need to understand why. But nevertheless, so he comes down from the mountain, Jesus with the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he sees, and notice how Mark ties in to the scribes. Okay. This is not a comparative analysis of the synoptic gospels. In other words, of looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of this. So I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to just stop right there. And I'm just going to say, Mark hones in the discussion to the dispute that the scribes were having with the remaining 9 disciples of Jesus. Now, he doesn't say what the content of that arguing or disputation was all about. He just simply says Jesus comes down and he sees this activity, and Jesus, like the guardian, he is such a wonderful father figure. He is such a beautiful shepherd. Notice what he says. When Jesus sees him, it's like he comes to protect them. He comes to their aid, and he kind of like stands in between and asks the scribes, what were you discussing with them about? It's almost in a protective manner. But nevertheless, so coming from that mountain, all of a sudden the people seem to be surprised to see Jesus, and they began running towards Jesus. And we know that would always be the case at this point in the ministry of Jesus. Wherever he would go, he would be inundated with large masses of people. So the crowd is getting ready to come to Jesus, and Jesus is now coming upon his disciples, and he sees the scribes arguing with his disciples about something, and Jesus says, what's going on here? And we continue. And one of the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought you, my son. That's important. I brought you, my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. All right. So now we get to the instance for this situation. So a man comes out and he greets Jesus with respect. He calls him teacher. And he said, I brought my son to you. And that's important. The man initially was bringing his son to Jesus so that Jesus might cast the demon out of his son. But remember, Jesus was gone and he was up in the mountain with the 3 disciples, the transfiguration. And so Jesus was not there. And so the man turned his attention to the disciples of Jesus. And this is important. There was nothing wrong with the man requesting, since Jesus was not there, for the disciples of Jesus to cast the demons out, because what? Remember, Jesus had already given his disciples power to cast demons out. That's important to see. He had already given them powers to cast demons out and to do many marvelous works. So nothing unusual about this. And the disciples, in their natural expectation, would also find nothing unusual about the request. But there was a problem. The man brought his son, but before we even get there, we look at this particular demon and notice the aggressive and destructive nature of this demon. Notice, first of all, he says, this spirit makes him mute. But we also find out at the end, I think it's in verse 25, in this text today, this demon made him unable to hear and speak. This is important. We'll talk about that once we get down to the end of it, to the casting out of this demon. But nevertheless, he couldn't hear, he couldn't speak. And notice, it seizes him, slams him to the ground. The boy begins to foam at the mouth, grinding his teeth, and he just stiffens out with convulsions. It sounds like the appearance of like epilepsy, but whatever the idea was, whatever was going on, it looked as if the boy was being caused by a demon, severe epileptic seizures. I think sometimes they refer to as grand mal seizures. But now let me say this before I go any further. This is not to say that when you see these things, even today, say, for instance, sickness and diseases or these particular types of seizures, this does not say that this is caused by a demon. Now, it may very well be, but every case has to be looked at for its own self, for its own merit, right? It doesn't say that whenever you see this, that means that there is a demon. No. But what we are saying is this boy's demon possession gave him the symptoms, those things that were symptomatic of seizures, of epileptic seizures. Do you understand that? Not every time you see something, oh, that's a demon. Not necessarily so. It may not be. It just simply may be sickness. All right. But nevertheless, what we do see is the very destructive nature. And we're going to see that even more so as we continue in this text. And so he says what? The idea, finding you not here, because I brought my son to you, I turned to your disciples. They were also doing this as well to cast him out. But there's a major problem. The disciples could not do so. Now, this might give us a hint to the arguing of the scribes with the disciples, something dealing with their inability to cast out demons, because they were able to do these things as followers, as representatives of Jesus, the Messiah. You get it? And what was the scribes and the Pharisees? What was their problem? Jesus is not the Messiah. And now what happens? We have an occasion here by the which at one time the disciples were able to do these things. And now it seems that they cannot do them. It seems to be an occasion for the scribe to say, we got him. You guys can't cast him out. Jesus is not what you guys claiming him to be. You guys are illegitimate in what you claim to be because of this. That seems to be the occasion here, right? So the man brings the boy to Jesus to be healed. The disciples have to, so Jesus is not there. Turn to the disciples. They cannot. And what? Let's continue. And so now 19, Jesus responds. And he answered them. That is so key. Who is the them? That sets it up for us all. Okay. He answered them and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. Now, this is the key. So let me just deal with verse number 19 and we're going to move on. I understand that there is not so much as a big crowd that is around Jesus that he is addressing. Yes, there is, in a sense, a crowd that Jesus is addressing. But pinpointedly, Jesus is not, and there is that man in particular. Yes, that man. And there is also those scribes that are there disputing with the disciples. Yes. But more so, Jesus is directing his words to his disciples. You see, remember, if you've been following me in Mark, and it's so necessary that as you try to study a particular passage, you need to understand the book. You need to understand the movement of the entirety of the book in order to understand passages uniquely, in order to particularly. You understand it? In other words, you cannot understand a passage of scripture in isolation. Just simply look at it all by itself, absent of any context, and really understand what's going on. For the most part, you have to look at the immediate context. For the best part, you need to look at holistically the context. That is, you have to bring in the context of the book in its entirety, how the book has been moving thus far. How has Mark been moving thus far? Remember, we've already told you Jesus has turned away his focus from Israel, trying to get Israel to accept him as the Messiah, the King of Israel. That is now off the table. Jesus has, ever since the point of them calling him demon possessed, Jesus concentrating on the new mystery kingdom, which be the church. The disciples Jesus has been preparing the disciples for their future ministry in the new kingdom, in the church that is to come. So he has been preparing them, teaching them, instructing them. And so thus we see here, it is not so much directed to the crowd, Jesus' statement when he says, unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? This is more so pointed to the disciples, to simply to say, my disciples, you have to get to a certain point. You have to get to a certain point of your faith and your trust in God. Why, my disciples? Because I am not going to be with you much longer. And you'll see in the whole of all of these things, what has Jesus been saying? The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, be persecuted, rejected, crucified. I'm not going to be with you guys much longer. So whatever, you need to be in good shape. And that's the point. So I'm not going to hammer that. But what I need you guys to see, and what Mark wants you guys to see, is that this coming is directed primarily to the disciples because of their lack of faith. You see, okay, beautiful thing. I might as well, since I'm here. You see, the disciples had already been given power, haven't they? Yes, but there is something else that they need. And I'm going to stop right there. And we're going to continue the text. But nevertheless, Jesus displays his intention to heal that boy and simply says, bring him to me. Verse 20, they brought the boy to him. When he saw him, that's important. You got to get the he right. You got to get the pronoun he right. Immediately, the spirit threw him into a convulsion. Falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. It has often thrown him both into fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Okay, now let's talk about that. So now they brought the boy to Jesus, and Jesus takes the boy to the side. Remember, there was a crowd around. Jesus is no longer performing miracles in the public. Remember, public miracles was the reason why he did that were to attest that Jesus was the Messiah, that Israel, the nation, might believe him and receive him as king. This is no longer on the table. So the miracles Jesus does is privately for the benefit of those in that immediate audience who will be the boy, the father, and Jesus' disciples. So Jesus will take them aside. You'll see that at the end. Well, Mark he will let us know that Jesus does this again, takes him away from the crowd. But nevertheless, notice verse 20 says, when he saw him. The he is the demon. That is, looking through the boy's eyes, the demon saw Jesus and he recognized Jesus. And the demon manifested his hatred for, it was two things that you can really see. He was showing Jesus how much I hate you. And he was showing that boy how much I hate you and I want to kill you. And we see this even in the text. Again, what did Jesus say? For the thief has just one purpose: steal, kill, and ultimately do what? Destroy. The devil, I have said it before, I say it again, if the devil could, he would kill us all in an instant. If he could. He has that much hatred for God, hatred for the Lord Jesus, and hatred for humanity. But anyway, so when that demon saw Jesus, notice what he did, threw him on the ground. In other words, knowing that demon knew he was about to get put out. He knew Jesus was getting ready to cast him out. And you know what he did? He said, let me say it this way. He said, I tell you what, he might throw me out, but before he throws me out, I'm going to kick your behind one more time. I'm going to kick your behind for the goal. Before I get kicked out myself, I'm going to kick you one more time. And this is what we see. The boy now thrown into another seizure, convulsing and foaming at the mouth and rolling all on the ground. And we see the compassion of Jesus in verse 21. How long has this been happening? We see compassion and we see the humanity. And when I say the humanity of Jesus, I don't want to get into a big theological discussion, but we see the concern for Jesus for that child. How long has it been happening? He says, ever since he has been a very small boy. And notice again, here's that evidence again of the demon, of the devil, of Satan's desire for humanity. What? He has thrown him into the fire, into the water. What was his desire to do to that boy? To destroy him. And that is Satan's desire for us. Now, what you have to understand, let's go back into the situation. The man brought the boy to Jesus to cast out the demon, and Jesus was not there. He was up in the mountain. So he turned to the disciples. And apparently, you can probably see in your mind the disciples just trying to cast out the, oh, I like this. Oh, wait till we get to the end. The disciples trying to cast out the demon because Jesus gave them power to cast out the demons, and they have had many successes in casting out demons before, and they're trying to cast out the demon and casting out the demon, and nothing's happening. And they're just struggling to cast them out. And then all of a sudden they begin to be ridiculed by the scribes and the Pharisees. And so now you can see the man becoming discouraged. In other words, it took faith. It took faith for the man to come to Jesus. He had to believe this. But remember, Jesus is not there, turning to the disciple. So he still has a measure of faith when he turns to the disciples. Now the disciples have completely failed. You can now begin to understand the man's dissipation, his lacking of faith. Now you see why he says to Jesus, if you can do anything, take pity and help us. In other words, the man has lost faith because of the situation, and now he turns to Jesus, and he doesn't have much faith in Jesus as well. But watch what Jesus does. 23, and Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. And so thus Jesus not so much as turning the table, because remember, ever since this point in the ministry of Jesus, as he is dealing with people now, since the point of people calling the leaders, calling Jesus demon possessed, Jesus' period of training his disciples, whenever people would come to Jesus, Jesus taking them privately. In the earlier beginning of his ministry, Jesus did miracles. He did things apart from people's faith. But now it is necessary for the individual coming to Jesus to have faith. And so that's what Jesus is doing. He's not so much turning the table, but Jesus is trying to tell the man, yes, have faith in me. You need to have faith in me. And what does the man do? The man responds honestly to Jesus. What is the honesty? He says, I do believe a little bit, but I cannot deny I have unbelief. My faith is shaking. And Jesus took that mustard seed of that man's faith, and he performed a great miracle for the man. So the point that I'm stressing, it was necessary for this man to have faith. But at the same time, the man did tell the truth and acknowledge that his faith was shaky. He did have some unbelief. And let me make a practical statement to that, because sometimes we want to act like it's necessary. You got to remember this, and I don't want to preach it. I don't. But sometimes we want to act like it's necessary for you to have faith that just is unbreachable, faith that is perfect in every single way, or otherwise that's going to be trouble or something. All I'm trying to say, don't you know, God knows your heart. God knows your thoughts. Even when you are praying, God knows that there are sometimes there is a flicker of doubt. There is a flicker of unbelief inside of us. God knows these things, and God is not angry. I don't know how some people understand God. Look at Jesus. John, okay, I'm about to preach it now. John, the Gospel of John, said this. This is the prologue of John. John 1, verses 1 through 18. Jesus is the manifest person of God. He is God made into flesh. And then he continues on at the very end of that prologue. Jesus exegeted God the Father. I like that. I don't want to go too deep. What do I mean? In other words, all that man needed to know about God could be seen in Jesus, could be known by Jesus. That's why Jesus said, when you see me, you have seen the Father. That's why I'm about to preach. That's why in the Gospel of John, you have more narrative from Jesus than any other gospel. Check it out. You got the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Look at the words of Jesus. Compare them to the teachings of Jesus in the gospel. Jesus says more in John's gospel than any other gospel. Go to the upper room, John chapter 13. Notice how long Jesus talks. He speaks chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. My God, he's going on and on to let you see what God is like, to let you see how God thinks. What's my point? When you see how Jesus acts, that's how God the Father acts. What's my further point? Stop trying to act like you some kind of a super saint when you are not. If you have unbelief, if you go to God in prayer and you're seeking God, God do this for me, or God do this for me, and you know that James said, if you come to God, you need to have faith. For a man who has faith is a stable man. A man who does not have faith is unstable like the waters. You tell God, Lord, I do believe, but there is part of me. I have doubts, Lord. Will you help me? Help me in my unbelief. Make my faith what it needs to be. Make me what I need to be. This is what you do. Don't pretend like I know God. No, okay, I'm done. Stop faking, stop pretending, and tell God the truth he already knows. And God will have mercy. And this is what the man was asking. Have mercy on me and my son. Jesus, I do believe you, but I cannot deny. My faith has been shaken. And Jesus says, that's enough. And Jesus worked with what he had. God will fix you. God will fix your faith. Okay, finishing the text. Sorry for the preaching. So what happens? Jesus, verse number 25, it goes back to what I was saying to you guys earlier. When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, see it now. The miracles were not for public consumption, not for the public. This was done in private. When he saw that the crowd was gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again. After crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. So now is the miracle. What? Jesus saw that crowd. Again, the point that I was saying to you earlier, the miracles was private. At this time, he rebuked the unclean spirit. He cast out the demon, and notice again the effect the demon had on him. He made the boy deaf and unable to speak. Again, this was what we call what? A messianic miracle. Why? Because it was believed. Remember, okay, first of all, let me say it very briefly, guys. I'm going to bring it to your remembrance and attention. The Jews cast out demons, but in order to cast out demons by the Jews, they had to get the name of the demon, ascertain the demon's name. So the boy had to, the one, whoever was demon possessed, had to be able to hear and to speak. And then getting the name of the demon, the Jews would cast out the demons. But if the boy couldn't hear and speak, they couldn't cast him out. Thus, they believed that when the Messiah would come, only the Messiah could cast out a deaf and dumb or mute demon, a demon that made a person unable to hear and unable to speak. So again, we see a messianic miracle. Jesus not needing the boy to hear and speak. Nevertheless, he cast out this demon. And notice when he cast out the demon, he told him, do not enter him again. Now, without me going into a lot of talking about that should speak for itself. That even though demons can be cast out, demons can re-enter. So whatever the occasion might be, or whatever the situations might have been that allowed the demon to come in, if something does not happen to keep that demon out, he is subject to re-entering again. It's kind of like what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 12. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but just remember for yourself, Jesus says when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry and desolate places, but he makes a determination. He says, seeing that house swept, he makes a determination, I will return. And what does he do? He takes in with him even other demons more wicked and powerful than himself and re-inhabits that individual. Now, even though Jesus was speaking parabolically about Israel, nevertheless, the nature and essence of what he was saying was true. And thus we see Jesus saying to this particular demon, what? Do not go back into him. And again, we see the destructive and hateful nature of the demon. Again, he threw that boy into convulsions in such a powerful way. Notice, he had to come. He was gone then. He knew he was gone. He did everything that he could, short of death, in so much what? Everybody looked, that boy was in such an exhaustive state. It just exhausted his body. His body was just out of it. They thought the boy was dead. But Jesus, knowing that the boy was still alive, he took the boy by the hand, and they saw that the boy was actually alive, right? And so the boy got up. Now, here is our key. We've seen this in the Gospel of Mark, as we've been talking about earlier, how Mark, in comparison to Matthew and Luke, spends a lot of time on this, and how we've been looking at the nature of what is happening. We need to see what is the driving point of Mark. And here we come to it, verses 28, 29. When he came into the house, that is Jesus, his disciples began questioning him privately. Why could we not drive it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot come out by Lord, I'm about to preach here. I'm about to preach. Okay. It can't come out by anything but prayer. And no, I wasn't about to preach about casting out demons. Let me tell you about it. So the disciples come to Jesus. And remember, you got to keep it all in mind. And I've already told you, Jesus gave them power to cast out demons, power to heal the sick. He had already given them this power. And so the disciples were going about, they had been going about. Now listen, as it were, simply by function. What did I say? As it were, simply by function. Jesus gave us the power, and guess what we're going to do? We're going to use the power. But all of a sudden, they ran upon a particular situation, this man bringing their son to Jesus. Jesus gone, so he turned to them and to cast out a demon, this situation here. And all of a sudden, that function that they had been normally doing, casting out demons, they were unable, they were astounded in doing their job. Did you hear what I just said? In doing their job. And now you can see kind of on the side a little bit of ridicule by the scribes and the Pharisees, and Jesus having to come to their rescue, so to speak. And now we see Jesus and his words. How long, guys? even my disciples. Shall I be with you? I'm not going to be with you always. How long shall I suffer with you? How long shall I bear with you? What is the problem? Why are you so spiritually dull? And so they, at the end, say, Jesus, why couldn't we do it? He said, it was because of your spiritual estate. It was because of your, I'm about to preach. It was because of your lack of prayer. You see, it was because of your, it was a job to you. What the powers that I gave to you was a job to you. It was not about you being in communion with God. It was not about you having fellowship with God. That's what I mean when I say spiritual estate. That's what Jesus is talking about when he says faith in God. And then he said, even this kind, that means this particular this kind of demon. All demons are not the same. Some are weak and some are powerful. But my point, Mark is driving. Jesus is driving to the disciples. Being an apostle of Jesus is not just simply a job. It is about you having an ongoing, prayerful relationship with your God. It is about you being in tune with heaven, you walking in fellowship with God. It is more than a job. You need to have, and see, the reason what's driving me right now, saints, is to the preacher, is to the pastor. This is more than a job. It's more than going to seminary. It's more than learning Greek and Hebrew. It's more than counseling people when they come to seek you for need. It's more than getting ready and preparing your Sunday sermon or your midweek Bible study. This is more than that. What we do is about us having relationship, fellowship with our God. We as pastors always need to be, let me tell you something, preacher. I know you got to pray. I know you got, I'm sorry. I know you got to preach. I know you have duties and I know you have responsibilities in the church. But what is, if I asked you the truth, how much time, how much real time do you spend in prayer? I'm not asking you, Lord, give me understanding of the text that I'm about to preach. I'm not talking about that. But how much time do you have real communion with God that your faith in God may be unbreakable, that you might face a situation that you yourself might say, oh, I got surprised by that, but I was unmoved. Why? Because my relationship, my fellowship with God is ongoing. And the only way you can do that is spending time with God in prayer. And that's what it's all about. This is more than a job. It comes to you having for yourself, between you and God, mature relationship, faith, trust in God. And this only comes when you spend time with God. You spend quality time alone with God. The ministry is more than just functions, something that Jesus has given to you. What do I mean? Jesus had given to the disciples these powers to do. And so what? They just automatically assumed when they saw the man, just do the job and cast out the demon. But they got surprised. Why? Because their spirituality was lacking. Their faith was lacking. Why? They themselves aren't spending time with God. And the same thing applies to us here. It's more than just Jesus giving us duties to do. See about the church and teach and all. What about you and your faith? Oh, unbelieving generation. Okay. I'm done. I thank God for that lesson. And I even personally want to take this to heart. Let's review. I'm done. So even though now I can see why Mark wants to spend so much time. You see, this is all about the preparation of the disciples. It's all about that. One day Jesus is going to be gone. You need to be in good spiritual shape. So, okay, do the review. Preaching over. What? So all of a sudden, Jesus coming down from the mountain, he sees some men arguing, the scribes with his disciples. He asks him, why are you arguing with them? Jesus in protect mode. A man comes out and said, Jesus, this is what's going on. Brought my son to you. You weren't here. So I turned to your disciples so they can cast out this demon, a demon who always seeks to destroy my son, and turn to your disciples, and they could not. And then Jesus directing his attention to those disciples of his. And that's why you can see Jesus bewailing in a sense. Oh, faithless and unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? Knowing that he has just a short time before his death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. Short time to prepare them how they need to be. But nevertheless, Jesus says, bring the boy to him. He sees the crowd gathering. Jesus moves away from the crowd. He asked the man, the demon, seeing Jesus, the demon showing his true nature. I hate God. I hate Jesus. I hate this boy. He throws the boy into a violent convulsion. Jesus says, how long has this thing been happening? And the man said, ever since he's been a child, this demon has been trying to kill him one way or another, by fire, by water. He's always been seeking the boy's harm. Jesus turns his attention to the demon. You demon who makes deaf and dumb, come out and don't you ever go back. The demon hit that boy one more time. They thought he was dead, but he wasn't. Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up. The disciples, probably with a little pride. See, it has no place here. Pride has no place. Pride has no place with us at any time. They came into the house. Jesus, why couldn't we heal them? Jesus said, because your spirit is not what it needs to be. You have not been praying. This kind can only come out by praying. And so thus he gives us a grand lesson. He gives all ministers a grand lesson. It is more than our duties to perform, but it's also about our personal spirituality, our personal relationship with God apart from the church, all by ourselves. All right. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me with that. Join me next time as we continue in the Gospel of Mark. See you next time.